Today on the Hobby Bench, I'll be looking at Crossbow Survivor from Warlord Games. So I'm working on my survivors for County Road Z, and I've got here a model from Warlord Games as a survivor armed with a crossbow. Obviously, typical contrast paints when I'm working with them, it's just gray, dry brush with white. And so I'll be working on his skin first, and then working on his clothing and working outwards. And I'll be using Vallejo Xpress Paints for these. I'll be starting off with Battledress Brown. It's a nice brown color just to go over skin. And like typical contrast paints, you're just going to work through one section at a time pretty carefully. These are rather opaque paints, so actually I'm not even really thinning it out. I'm just pretty much using it straight out of the bottle. And what I find sometimes too when we're working with these paints that really I would recommend trying to get a brush with a fine tip that's actually pretty large. So you can have quite a bit of pigment that's in the bristles of the brush, but it'll work down to a fine point. So rather than like working with a very small, maybe an O brush or maybe a 2O brush, something that's, obviously very fine point, you really want something that's going to be larger, that can carry a lot of pigment. And that allows that contrast paint to work. It'll just like really flow well into the cracks and crevices of the model. This is the ideal way to work with them. And here you can see I've got his skin done. I ended up using 2 coats actually, just to get that really nice deep chocolate color. And so I'm going to continue on using the contrast paints to work on his pants. And for those, I'll be using Commando Green. And this just sort of typifies how you'll be working with contrast paints. You just want to work on one section at a time and just, carefully go through it, trying to get even coverage as much as possible. And here you can really see how, the contrast paints work. They really get into the crevices and creases of the pants and the folds of that, give a nice deep shade. And the other areas that are a little bit lighter, the upper areas of his folds, that's where it sort of thins out. And working with contrast paints like this, I really enjoy. It makes the job pretty easy to do, and you get some really good, nice results. I've got the pants done, and you can see that the Commando Green really gives it a great combat fatigue look. So now I'm going to be working on his tunic, and for that I'm going to be using Desert Ochre. I like this as it's a lighter shade. It gives it a little bit of color, but still is a little subtle. So it's a nice yellow-orange look. And like with a lot of your typical contrast paints, again, I'm just going to be working through one section at a time very carefully, trying to get an even coat as much as possible. And, using that larger brush at the fine tip just allows that pigment to flow into the cracks and crevices and get over the surface of the model and get a nice even coat and really let the medium in the contrast paint do its work. So you can see that it got his shirt done, and you can see that Desert Ochre gives it a lovely look. There's a bit of color, but still subdued. And so now I'm going to be working on the rest of his kit, working on his canteen and on his shoes. And for here, I'm going to try to go for a leather look. So I'm going to try military yellow. I'm not too sure, how this is going to actually look, but I'm just going to give it a try anyways. Sometimes you just got to do some experimentation and sort of see how things go. And hopefully, if it's really bad, you can always go back and reprime it and that section again and go over it one more time. And so just like you're working with typical contrast paints, going to work at one section at a time, carefully go through it, try to get nice even coverage over it, try not to miss any spots, and just let that medium within the pigment do its thing. Now at this point, you could say the model's just good enough for the tabletop. You could throw it on down and finish it. And if I was working with a bunch of zombies, maybe 30 or so, I probably would just leave it at that. I mean, that's what these contrast paints are for. Give a good foundation and go with it. But I want to give it some more depth. So I'm going to be using medium olive to go over its pants and bring out those highlights more. And, here you just want to try to be careful, use a nice thin coat. And I'm going to be going over the creases of the pants and just bring out more of that highlight. And it's just a matter of carefully going through this, trying to pick out areas that would gather a lot of the light. It's a lighter shade and work through that. And you want to just be careful. I'm using a different brush here. It's a little bit more of a fine traditional brush that you'd use for putting on paint. And I'm just carefully going over those areas that look like it would be an upper fold of a crease. And you can sort of see already it has like a lighter shade because of the contrast paints. That's really the areas I'm going to focus on and highlight and accentuate that lighter tone and really try to bring some more depth to the model than you typically would have just with a contrast base coat. And I'm just working carefully through this, just doing one section at a time. For those larger areas that might catch a little bit more light, I'm just sort of using a nice little cross hatch, just really thin strokes, and fill out the volume of those pants that would catch that light. And here you can see the final results of his pants, working with that medium olive, just gives it a tad more depth. So I'm going to be doing the same thing for the shirt. I'm going to be using German Camo Orange for that. And like with the pants, get the upper folds, get the upper creases, and just try to get that with that lighter shade. Make sure it catches the light. Now you want to try to be careful here. You want to try to make sure you not get into those areas that have a lot of the contrast paint pigment, that, the deeper areas, the deeper folds that have that shade. If you do in a pickle like that, you can always try to go back with the contrast paint and fill that section in and add some more depth to it. You just want to carefully work through this. And like I said, just let that pigment do its work and really bring out that highlight that you want. And here you can see the final result. It really sort of accentuates those upper folds and adds some more depth to the model. And I think overall looks pretty good. I think we're pretty much done. Now I've gone back and just to really show this off camera, but I painted his hair and the crossbow black. And now I'm going to give the crossbow some more of a highlight. I'm just using USA Olive Drab. This is going to be a simple dry brush. Carefully going through everything here, trying not to get it on anything else in the skin right now, and just work my way into it. And this is going to give a small, subtle highlight to the crossbow and add a tad more depth to it. So nothing fancy here, just doing a quick dry brush and giving it a pretty even coat, trying to pick out some more of those details and give it a very nice, subtle look. And that's it. The Survivor is done. Now, the PVA glue I've got here for my flock still needs to dry. That's why it looks a little lighter. And I've also gone back for that canvas on his canteen, and I gave it a thinned wash of medium olive just to make it stand out a bit different from the other stuff on his kit. But you can see that military yellow also gives a nice light leather look. I love working with contrast paints. I think they do what they're supposed to do, and that is to get things ready for the tabletop and make it look pretty decent. And if you just add some more highlight to those, just using lighter shades, you can bring out far more depth of the model than you normally would just working with contrast. But overall, looks good. Can't wait to get him on the tabletop.